Hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well, despite the rather strange situations that we find ourselves in today. Welcome to this Talakayan episode on fandom, which I think is a phenomenon that we're all very familiar with, and something that we all have our own particularly strange relationships with as well. My name is Andrew T, and I am the facilitator for this discussion. And I will be joined by my friends and colleagues, AJ Elicaño, who teaches in biology but whose background is in fine arts. And we have Serena Vaswani, who teaches in the ComDep but whose undergrad degree was in mathematics. I think both of these people, I've known them quite well, and we get along really well. And among the things that we have in common is that we take our experiences of fandom quite seriously, sometimes too seriously. But hopefully this drives us to have a good and fun talk about this thing, this very, very strange thing. Thank you. Hope you enjoy. So, how are you guys doing?
Hi, Andrew. I'm doing well.
I'm good too.
There's a funky little error message on my screen.
But still doing well. That sounds just about right, I think.
Yep.
Right. So, what was the last thing that got you all crazy? Like, what was the last thing that you saw, watched, read, whatever?
I guess for me it would be Shadowhunters. That was the last. That's the last active fandom. Well, it's still active, but the show is over.
Right.
But that's the last one that I've been super into, and that's still continuing until today. I haven't found something new that's caught my interest so deeply yet.
Okay, right. How about you, AJ? What's the latest emotional investment that you've done?
So, is this a question about the latest fandom that I've gotten into, or the latest fandom thing that
could be either of those. I think either one is fine.
Because in terms of latest fandom thing, I'm a big X-Men guy, which means that we get stuff every week because it's weekly comics. If I talk about the X Office and how much they're doing and how integrated they are, it will take 3 hours. So I'm going to stop. But I think in terms of latest fandom, I think belatedly I finally started watching 30 Rock.
Okay.
And that is, it's old, and it shows it's old, but it's also a lot of fun.
Okay, right. Right, and as for me, well, I've long been following all sorts of different things, and I'm the kind of person who, when I get hooked on a particular text, my relationship inevitably turns out to be a fanish relationship. Foremost on my mind, however, since I'm doing my PhD thesis on it, is BTS. And BTS has also been releasing so much content that I keep having to fix my scope and limitations. And I will be covering the period from this.
Because it's live.
Yeah, exactly. At the same time, though, it's rather strange because I'm not working directly on BTS fandom. And although I'm not denying my own fanish engagement, which is in fact the motivation for why I've been doing this for the past 3 years. My relationship with fandom is a little strange. I approach fandom through text. So I'm looking at music videos, I'm looking at performance videos, I'm looking at these audiovisual artifacts, if you will, and I'm trying to detect, or I'm trying to trace, I'm trying to draw out the ways in which they appeal to people like me, to fans like me, but I'm not looking at actual people. I think in your case, you do have that sort of relationship as well, right? I mean, if we're shifting from fandom in general to fandom as an academic field, as an academic subject, right? Do you have where are you at with regards to that?
So for me, it's really fan work as text. So in the work that I've done so far, and you would know this, Sir T, because you're my thesis advisor, is that I've been looking at fan fiction, and I think that's actually my favorite thing about fandom is fan fiction, and so that's what I'm interested in sort of understanding more. So much of the work that I've done academically has really been looking at it as a text as well, and trying to see the pleasure in the text itself rather than talking to fans directly so far in terms of research. So yeah.
I think mine is similar. I'm doing my MA thesis on music. My MA is in creative writing. I'm doing creative nonfiction, and I'm trying to do something on music and memoir and the ways in which the songs that I associate with and how those sort of intersect with prominent memories and relevant experiences and that sort of thing. And so on a personal note, what that means for me is I've always been a music fan, or I've always considered myself a music fan, but I realized I was never a big concert person. I would see Linkin Park whenever they were around, but I would not frequently go to stuff. I think 2019 was the only year where I'd been to 2 concerts. Which is lucky, because 2019 was the last year we could go to concerts before the world ended.
Was Carly Rae? Was Carly Rae one of them?
Yeah, Carly Rae and Mike Shinoda. Both in the same theater, which was really or the same venue, which was really interesting because it's the same venue, but the energies were so different, and that was just really interesting to me, both as a fan and as someone kind of doing academic work on that. So. The metaphor is that I've always been a music fan, but I tend to be the music fan who listens to music alone.
Okay.
And then I talk to people about it after, but I'm not actively live tweeting my album listen or whatever.
Okay.
So I think in a very similar way, my approach to fandom in terms of my academic work has been through text. And even when I engage with fan communities, it's always in the context of talking about songs or issues or episodes. And the weird flip side of it is that because I'm kind of doing this creative nonfiction, personal essay, music space, if I want to be flippant about it, I'll say that I'm producing fan nonfic.
That actually makes sense. That actually makes a whole lot of sense. Right.
It's like meta.
Kind of, yeah. There's and personal essayists love meta.
Yeah,
the purpose of the text.
It's the mode that you shift to introduce
when you're stuck trying to reflect on something. When I was writing this, I felt that.
Yeah, it's like a shift in the key of a song, for example, or if you put a bridge or something like that, or it could be those certain moments in television programs. Sorry, Serena, just wanted to ask out of curiosity, have you seen The Good Place?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I have.
That big moment in season 1 that changed everything. So no spoilers.
Yep.
But that big moment.
It's fine.
Right. So anyway, I think doing meta. So when you're writing or when you're engaging with things, sort of does that sort of thing. Right. AJ, you mentioned energies, and energies I think is a very good word to think about when you look at fandom. From my understanding, so I don't directly engage in fandom studies, but I am I do follow the topic, so to speak. So I am not a researcher in fan studies, but I do follow the topic. Mostly it started because of Serena's thesis. But also because I think as an academic, I find myself in this position where I have to try to make sense of this thing. This thing takes up so much of my time. Instead of doing my work, I'm just indulging these things. So perhaps one way of giving myself an excuse as to why I'm doing all these things, right? So I try to follow what people are saying. The way I see it, and again, if there are people watching this who are more enmeshed in fandom studies than I am, I'd love to hear from them. But the way I see it is that the big contribution, one might say the most prominent area within fandom studies is looking at actual flesh and blood people, looking at actual real persons and looking at their reactions. So it's not about abstractions. It's about really paying attention to how fandom is such an active process. And I think that ties in a little bit with what AJ said about energies. Like, there's an energy that comes when you're watching a concert and picking it up with the people at the moment. But now, since we're doing texts though, does that play out somehow? I mean, what kind of energy do you think, we can draw out of texts? I don't think it's non-energetic work. But how is that different?
Oh, wow.
I think that I would connect it, and I would connect it with storytelling. Because a text is telling a story. I would go so far as to say that everything is a story. And it's just a matter of like which story is more dominant and which stories are sort of not really getting that much visibility or attention, right? And I think for me, when I look at fan texts, it's space that can easily sort of reproduce these disparities in which stories are getting told and which aren't. But then it's also a space where somebody who doesn't necessarily have like the large production capital to mount like a story can just say like, I just want to talk about this thing that nobody's talking about, and so I'm going to write about it. But the thing is, I'm looking at the text as symptomatic or sort of like indicative of these investments and what these investments mean, right? So of course I think like there's a lot of richness that can come from actually talking to fans and complementing that with work of looking at actually the text that they're making. But I would say that the energy in the text itself is when you just look at the really creative and brilliant ways that they just change things, like when you ask what if questions, and when you just say that, I'm gonna take this thing that is finished, everybody's watched it, it's done, and then I'm gonna say, it's not done, and I'm just gonna make all this raw material, and then I'm gonna take this raw material and make this whole new story out of it. I just think that's a really powerful thing. There's a lot of life to that, especially when you look at it as, these texts being not just things that you read on a screen, but even just like when you talk about something, when you post something on Twitter or whatever it is. So the meta text, so commentary around the fan fiction or the fan art or whatever it is. So the thing is, though, I'm like you said, right? Like I'm looking at it, or I have been looking at it really more from reading these things, as opposed to like, okay, you know what? I'm gonna go and talk to this person who wrote this thing and ask them like, why did you do this, and like, what are you getting out of it, and stuff like that. And I think there's value in both of those things. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think like just to jump off that, it's also interesting to see like trends in fan work. I keep thinking of, this is going to be a really weird reference, but if anyone watched Heroes,
I remember Heroes.
The kind of the NBC like what if superheroes were everyday people in the modern world thing, and there were these interesting trends there, which was like, I mean, obviously, like we're familiar with kind of a lot of fandoms will have like the pairings that people enjoy shipping. But what was truly deranged about the Heroes fandom was that the biggest ships were incestuous.
Okay.
Because like the actors had chemistry, and it's like, but you're related though. And that was fascinating to me, because it's like, what is it in the text or in the fandom that says that specifically because these people seem to have chemistry, even if the series isn't making them like romantically linked or anything, that people decide the thing to do, or that multiple people decide that the thing to do is, let's actually ship Peter and Claire, or Peter and Nathan, Claire and Nathan. Or all three of them sometimes. That was weird.
Okay. That I think is really okay. I'm probably gonna go down, when we're saying this right after you give an incest-related example, but that's really interesting.
Oh no!
All right, no, but I think the point of interest there is that there's a certain sense in which, if you look at the way fans, and here, we can speak for ourselves here. If you look at the way in which we relate to whatever it is that we're into. Like if I look at BTS, for instance, BTS, they're not performing characters in TV programs like Heroes or Shadowhunters, but to a certain extent, because there's a public persona that they're that they're displaying, there's a kind of gap, but there's also a kind of link between the two. If you think about it, when it comes to groups like BTS, and it's not just BTS, but when it comes to a lot of groups, especially in the K-pop fandom, there's a lot of shipping that happens also between members, which automatically queers the whole situation. And I think to a certain extent, when we teach communication theory, we often talk about parasocial interactions, and we often talk about how the traditional, conventional literature and parasocial interaction, or at least before it was actually studied in great detail, a lot of people were suspicious about it. A lot of people felt that fans were people who couldn't quite tell what was real and what was not. But I don't think so. I mean, and this is not just me defending myself. You know, this is me saying that
not just.
Yeah, but I think it just won't be possible for people to formulate these fantasies that they know are different from what's actually being said, from what's actually canonical from the producer's point of view. I don't think people are able to be as creative with their projections, so to speak, into these scenarios without realizing that there is the authoritative, authorized version, but deep down in my heart, deep in my head, I know this is true, right? So stuff like that. And I think it's a good way of picking things up, because I think when you talk about fandom energies, there is an energy that comes with the collective, with the communal thing. There is the sense in which, for example, when you first got into a fandom and when you realized that there were other people like you who were just as nuts about it, that's a powerful moment. You know, you may not have directly connected with that other person, but just knowing that there were some other people out there ranking the Astromech droids in Star Wars, depending on how feisty they were, for instance, just because there was if you have parang just realizing that there are people just like you who project and participate in this kind of discourse, in this kind of meta, whatever you call it, that I think is a good energy to tap into. At the same time, though, as individuals, and I think this applies a lot to my work. I watch these music videos over and over for my thesis, and there's a certain connection that I think I'm trying to reach between the ideas in my head, you know, all these theories and concepts, and the kind of pleasurable thing that I'm watching. And I'm trying to keep the pleasure alive. I'm trying to make sure that these two elements, the academic and the fanish element, I'm trying to make sure that they mix without losing themselves in each other, so to speak, right? And I think I'm not a scientist, so I'm probably going to be talking out of my hat here. But when we talk about the energies, I think there's this very, very complicated interchange of energies that happens. That, as a fan, I don't just feed on the energies of the fandom or from the fan text. I also contribute to it somehow. I also sort of add to it, and whether or not other people pick up on it, it's there. It becomes a part of that thing. When you, I don't know. Does that make sense to you? This kind of.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
I think, so for me, this is a thing that I personally struggle with a lot because, like you said, I did my undergraduate and graduate studies also in math, right, in applied mathematics. And, I think for me, when I was doing my thesis on clay and fan fiction, I spent a lot of time just saying, you know what, I need to justify why I'm doing this apart from the fact that I love this thing. Because as if there's you're not allowed to do research on something that you love. And I think over time, I've come to realize that, so we can talk about it with the concept of critical distance, right? You are supposed to maintain a critical distance between the scholar and the thing that you're studying. But then, I think that interest is there in all fields, regardless of whether it's science or art or whatever it is, because why would you choose to study something if you didn't have some kind of investment or interest in it? Yep. So I think it's a matter of also being cognizant that, even the choice of what you want to research, that comes with your interest, also your institutional, the institutional interests that are at play there. And then also just realizing that maybe it's not necessarily about having to justify that, I'm sure you mentioned that, there's like you do this work because you also kind of want to make sense of and say I'm not wasting time when I'm super into this band, I'm doing it because there are these scholarly ways that we can appreciate it. And it's so I think for me it's that defensiveness I think is something that's always been there for me, at least in my own research, and over the years, like I said, I've come to realize that maybe it's not about defending that investment as much as it is studying that investment, studying that emotional connection, and just really treating the pleasures that you take from the work that you do seriously. Because I think that is something that propels a lot of even taking it out of fanish experience. Just looking at the way we interact with each other as people, they're very much intertwined with those those emotional investments we have in things. So I think that's the way I would see it, is that I've been doing a lot of work on trying to let go of the defensiveness around it, because I think it's worth studying, and I think it's when I try to maintain that critical distance, what I'm doing then is just saying that I can do critical distance as long as I am, and I do that by making sure that even by being transparent, I'm a fan of this thing, I'm studying this thing, I'm going to try and look at it from all of these different angles, and I think just being able to identify your positionality in the research makes a lot of difference in that respect. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Wow. Yeah. Great. Critical distance. Okay. Right. You guys know this. I did my MA in creative writing, and
oh boy.
My genre, my literary genre was poetry, and there was a certain section of the poems that I was writing that I used to refer to as fanpo as opposed to fanfic, fan-driven poetry. So I had all these weird parodic poems about Chinatown, about The Matrix, about Enter the Dragon, about Sunny Day Real Estate, Neutral Milk Hotel.
Wow.
There's one on Hegel, but I'm not a fan of Hegel, so that's like a moment of anti-fandom, so to speak.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Right. So I relied on poetry, and I relied on the metrics of poetry as a way to sort of create that critical distance. Now, AJ, you're talking memoir. You're talking, something autobiographical. So how does critical distance factor in what you're doing?
I mean, on some level, right? There is the call for some measure of distance whenever you write autobiography. Even kind of absent the fandom side of it for a moment, you need to be able to be responsible in the way that you kind of portray your life, particularly when other people are implicated. But also, there's a craft thing there, in that if you're too emotionally close, if stuff is too raw, if you're not able to make aesthetic and craft decisions about the ways that you write about things that matter to you, it may not be the moment to write about it, because then what are you actually doing? And I think in some ways the fandom, trying to kind of plug fandom into that is not that difficult, insofar as Serena said earlier, it's being honest about the fact that you are a fan of these things, and that they are kind of affecting the way that you process the world, the way that you engage them as text, the way that you kind of view them as filters for the rest of the world around you, but at the same time trying to write about them, speak about them in ways that, at least I think, make it a more open experience for your reader, as opposed to no, this is my thing.
Yes.
Watch me. I'm trying to think of a term that is not gonna be censored. Watch me privately enjoy my fandom and mock you for not getting it.
Okay.
It's hopefully not what that is. But also, I do want to kind of jump off the defensiveness point, if that's okay.
It's fine.
Because I remember, when Andrew earlier was mentioning this idea of feeling like you need to justify it. I think, in terms of kind of my own work, certainly I think the defensiveness is there, and it is something that I think I'm working on, that I think a lot of people need to work on. But there's also, I think, like a social and kind of social context component to that, because a lot of times I think I'll speak for myself, when I am kind of engaging in my fandom stuff, whether it's because I'm just listening to music or reading comics or writing personal essays about my life linked to the music I listen to, there's always like that little voice in the back of my head that goes, the world is burning and this is what you're doing. Like the feeling of you could be doing anything to help the world and this is what you're doing, and then the feeling of needing to justify that. Because I think, and that's not, I think, unique to me. I think especially now in kind of, you look at Twitter discourse, a lot of people feel like the things that they enjoy need to be morally good. The art that you like has to be unproblematic. It has to be made by good people. And like if someone turns out to be a bad person, then all their art sucks.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I saw a tweet last night, I think, which was from, let's just say, the subsets of Twitter that don't particularly like Zack Snyder movies.
Yeah, okay.
And someone was like, the fact that Zack Snyder, while making the movies that he makes, seems to be a genuinely nice and pleasant person to work with, just short-circuiting people's brains. Because he does seem like a very nice guy, even if the movies may or may not be to your liking.
Yeah, because those movies are... they've got a very vocal minority of fans and supporters, but they're generally critically panned.
Yeah.
And yet he's not a bad guy. He's not, morally speaking, he's about as nice as he can possibly get.
Yep. And I get where that's coming from, because I think, the thing a lot of people would say to that is we can separate the art from the artist, and then kind of the woke response to that, and not to put that down, but if you are consuming work and therefore giving money to bad people, then that's a bad thing. But I don't think people have kind of gotten themselves to the next stage yet, which means that you run into kind of people who don't like a Snyder movie, therefore they think it is bad, therefore he must be a bad person. Oh no, he's nice, what?
Yeah, and see, I think with that, and that's a very, very strange situation. That's like an open-ended question that's going to come up every now and then on social media and elsewhere. You can also sort of look at that in terms of the relationship between fans. That certain kinds of artwork attract certain kinds of fans.
Yeah.
And certain kinds of fans are stereotyped, for instance. One very, very fascinating example of this, and I say this as someone who's not really invested in the band, but the Juggalos, who are big fans of the Insane Clown Posse.
Right.
There have been documentaries made about them. Can share the link to you later on. It's on Vimeo. There have been documentaries made about them, and the overall sense that these documentaries provide is that the Juggalos, as wild as they are with clown face makeup and dreadlocks and really strange clothes and really listening to the loud, abrasive music of Insane Clown Posse, they're apparently very, very nice people. There are certain memes that go around, again, looking at it from my own experience in K-pop fandom. That meme where, from Lord of the Rings, where Gimli and Legolas are fighting, and he says something like, I never expected to be
fighting side by side with?
Yeah, I never expected to be fighting side by side with a dwarf or with an elf. I forgot who was saying
with
which
an elf.
line. Yeah, with an elf. So there's part there, I, a BTS army, never expected to be fighting side by side with a Juggalo, and yet here we are, and fighting side by side against, the alt-right, and fighting side by side against racists in society, and it's just wild. It's just amazing. Because if you look at it, I'm going to focus on those two fandoms. You look at BTS ARMY, often stereotyped as teenage girls. We're not all teenage girls. I am not a teenage girl. There's nothing wrong with being a teenage girl. But there's that sense in which the way in which fandom, for example, shades into real-world social activism, real-world social goods, good acts that have social relevance. That's something that tends to be understood differently by people because they have different expectations. They might think, oh, you guys are into this boy band, but you're also contributing to Black Lives Matter. You're also contributing to raising funds for the farmers, diba, parang who are suffering, etc. Blah blah blah. Or you guys, you dress up in clown makeup and you smoke weed and do whatever it is on these shows, and you listen to this really, really weird and strange music. But you guys have also been short-circuiting a lot of and trolling a lot of the alt-right social media accounts and just flooding them like anything. And I think there's that disjoint. I mean, I've always struggled with the idea of, let's say, making an aesthetic judgment and making a moral judgment. I do think there's a difference between the two, but I don't think they're not related. And I'm never quite clear as to what that relation actually is. Right? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I don't think it's necessarily the same relationship in every text, I want to say.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess to a certain extent that's where energies come in. I mean, there's a certain relationship that you have with a text that is renewed in the encounter with that text, whether you're reading it, watching it, listening to it for the first time or for the umpteenth time. So, for example, if you mentioned Zack Snyder earlier, if you look at someone like Joss Whedon, for example, I have been heavily invested in a lot of Joss Whedon properties. Like one of my big claims to fame, I think, here in Ateneo is that I taught the Buffy the Vampire Slayer class, right?
Yes.
So. That's significant for me, and I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer like anything. Except that now, with all the reports coming out of how Joss Whedon is actually like towards cast and crew, how he's actually like as a person, it's kind of tainted the work, right? Yeah. So. I still have my stuff. I'm not burning my DVDs. I'm not selling them or whatever, but I haven't watched them, and I'm a little afraid to watch them. A Joss Whedon property like The Avengers, which I'm not super invested in, I can catch bits of it and I'm fine. But I think it's something like Buffy, something that I've invested a lot of myself into. I guess I'm a little worried that the moral taint might appear on the product and might constantly transfer to myself as well. Again, there's this energy transfer. If we're talking about the pleasures that we get from the text, sometimes, and the pleasures that we get from judging texts, sometimes, I don't know about you, but I worry that sometimes the text can judge me also, or at least leave me open to judgment.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. What kind of sense do you make of that, Serena?
I think one of the things that I would also connect it to is just how taste can be a very judgmental thing. Just because, I mean, even just looking at fan studies itself, right? When I decided that I wanted to study clean fan fiction, one of the other things that I was a little bit apprehensive about is this isn't sci-fi, and within fan studies we have these sort of cultural hierarchies. I'm not saying that they're there and everybody supports them, but there are certain cultural hierarchies that you will find when you read through fan studies literature, and so there is this sort of feeling of judgment from the text itself that is this frivolous? What is this like? What is the point of this thing that I'm doing? So that's one aspect of it. But the other aspect that I wanted to also talk about, in relation to what you said about the conflicts and the clashes between, for example, the moral dimensions and the aesthetic dimensions of a text. I think one of the things that I have observed is that while it is a very, very uncomfortable thing, because I also love Buffy the Vampire Slayer very much, and I haven't actually watched it recently, similar to you, Sir D. But then, I think that it is something that I have to negotiate. So, this word negotiate, I think, is something that we can take for granted. There's usually a tendency that, okay, suddenly this new piece of information comes up, and then you have this word problematic. The minute you apply the label problematic to anything, it's sort of everybody's sort of hands off.
Yeah.
You're canceled or whatever. That was my younger days. I'm no longer into this thing,
Right.
So
Yeah.
whatever
I was young and dumb. Now I'm learned and
dumb.
progressive.
Exactly. Yeah, but then I think the harder thing, but the more valuable thing, which is again really hard to do, is to say that I can like something about this, but I can also not like things about this.
Yeah.
And those two things can be in the same space, and that's when you talk about energies of text, there's those clashing plates of different dimensions that you like, you don't like, you are a little scared of, or you're a little bit apprehensive of, and that's the work that you're doing, and that's why I also think it's so difficult to separate emotional or affect affective investment in something
Yeah.
because that's always going to be part of how you relate to it. And rather than saying, okay, like, you know, this is canceled, my problematic fave instead. So I can just say, you know, it's a problematic fave. I'm going to keep wrestling with it, and you know, I don't have to let go of the whole thing, but I have to work through it, and I have to then make decisions around the actions that I do. So, for example, will I decide to boycott this thing? Will I decide that I no longer want to contribute financially to this particular franchise, or will I find ways to do it outside official channels?
Yeah.
Like piracy.
Yeah.
So,
We can't. Yes.
so yeah, so I guess that for me, like, it's there is, I think when you say like the text judges you, I think it's also like the taste of other people judges me.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the scary part also, I think. Because it's like, will my friends think I'm a bad person because I still listen to like this artist who came out as an anti-masker, or I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So, since we're talking about taste, you know, there's just so much that we can talk about this. You know, we've talked about energies and the kinds of relationships that we have between text and other people and all that. You know, taste is such a big thing. But one of my favorite quotes about taste is from an American cultural critic named Dave Hickey. He said, "Bad taste is real taste, of course, and good taste is the residue of someone else's privilege." I love that. I love that. I'm not sure I agree with it 100%. I'd like to think that my examples of good taste are not just about privilege, but I love the fact that there's that sense that bad taste is real, somehow more real, for instance. And if we're, you know, we were just talking about like moral judgments and whatnot, you know, elements of guilt, for example. I don't like the term guilty pleasure. I try to avoid using the term guilty pleasure, except that I've somehow realized that I can still use the word not necessarily as a kind of aesthetic judgment, but as a kind of moral judgment. So, for example, let's say, and here we've been talking about popular culture, so forgive me for bringing in, you know, somebody from the age of literary modernism. But look at someone like Ezra Pound, for example. Ezra Pound was, for all intents and purposes, an execrable human being, but his poems are fantastic. At least I think so. And the way I see it is that Ezra Pound is sort of like my guilty pleasure. I know he's canonized in literary studies still, but there's a certain sense in which I love his work and I know how his views affected his work, but I love the work anyway, and I'm not sure how to work with that. So maybe guilty pleasure could be a way of negotiating the moral dimensions of the aesthetic artifacts that we encounter, right? Does that make any sense to you guys?
Yeah, no, as a Lovecraft fan, I get that.
Perfect example, yeah. True.
Although I think with Lovecraft and people who, you know, define the genre, there's sort of a get out of jail card in that, you know, the big defense of Lovecraft is like father of cosmic horror, and certainly that's true, you know, created Cthulhu, one of the most iconic cosmic horror creatures ever. But at the same time, it's a very specific genre, and so many people are continuing to work in that genre and are not raging racists. Lovecraft Country was entirely about kind of that sort of reclamation. It's a Lovecrafty series, but it's black led, it's black written, it's a black cast.
It's revisionist.
Yeah. It's one of those kind of, it's very much like the fanfic reclamation project. It's a fix-it fic.
Ah.
Yeah.
Oh, that does make sense. Right. It's actually similar to like the way in which if you adapt something or if you change something, you somehow become a participant in that, and you become you take a little bit of ownership. It might not be legally recognized ownership. You know, they might come after you with a cease and desist order or whatever it is that they can throw at you. But to a certain extent, when you do this, when you remix the culture or remake the culture or reboot the culture or whatever, I think there's a certain chance in which you can keep it alive but different. You can sort of not deny its legacy, but you can kind of sever it and allow it to go into some other direction altogether. Serena, do you write fan fiction? You don't have to tell us what your username is, but do you write fan fiction? Do you participate in this kind of remaking and remixing?
I did. I have written fan fiction. I read a lot more than I write. There's only one fandom that I've ever written fan fiction for, and that was How to Get Away with Murder.
Okay.
That was and I think this was also during a time when I was like, I want to try these different practices that I'm studying. So there was actually an element of that thing where, I was like, okay, I'm studying all these things, and like I'm reading all this stuff, and I just kind of want to try and write because I like writing, and maybe this would be a space to do that. So yeah, I do. I would say though that the writing that I've done okay, so this is not completely related to what you're asking, but I wanted to mention that what I like about the way that fan fiction works is that, especially if you publish it on some kind of archive, it's very interesting to see how How to Get Away with Murder is long over for quite some time back. But I will still get comments or kudos or whatever it is that later on that will come up and that will remind me of this thing that I wrote. And I think, okay, so in writing fan fiction, for me, I don't know if I would necessarily say I was revising things in a very I'm going to change the portrayals here because I found this problematic. I think what I was doing was more of, there were people who wanted to read things and then they would write I wish this thing happened, or I wish that thing happened, and I would say, let me write that thing for this person who wants to read this thing. So then I was like, okay, I'll take this request and I will write it and then I will publish it. So in that sense, I think reclaiming narratives can also just be a space also to, and I think that's why when we talk about adaptation, right, I'm going to bring in another fandom here, which is Shadowhunters. Shadowhunters is a book series. It's not a television show originally. It was a book, then they made a movie, and then they made a TV show. And you will find that each version of the story is different. And back in my very strong Harry Potter fandom days, I was that person who was like, it must be
Talk
exactly
about another
like the
tainted
book.
cultural text.
Right? I was like, it has taken us X long to get to Harry Potter.
Okay, I'm sorry, Serena, go on, please.
I would be like, no, this movie is not the story. This is not the story in the book. But then over time, I was like, by the time the third movie came out, I was like, I really love this movie, even though it really takes some very different turns away from the book. And so going back, again, sorry, I'm jumping fandoms here, but going back to Shadowhunters, there's a lot about the books that, I'm sorry, that I don't like. I feel like I have to apologize for that.
The book is always
apologizing to who? But okay, go on, Serena.
So there's a lot of the stuff in the books that I'm not so keen on. I don't like the way that the story was told. I don't like the way certain characters were built or not built, for that matter. That I think the TV show does a lot better. And so I think that's also the value when you have people who tell the story again, is that they're able to tell the story and pick at things that matter to them and that may actually matter to another person that didn't matter to the person who actually wrote this thing originally.
Right.
And so that's kind of where I see. I took the question you asked and made it something totally different.
That's fine. That's a great demonstration.
But that's how I see these mixing of adaptation, revision, reclaiming narratives, or even just sort of positing a what-if alternative narrative that can maybe open up spaces for these, representations, these experiences of life that you don't necessarily see in the mainstream popular culture. So.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
And I think it's also sort of, because I'm going to preempt Andrew before he asks me if I've written anything, so I will rip out my own heart first. I've published a few things, but not very much, and I haven't written in a while. But I think I have tended to, and like you, I've read more, much more than I've written, and much more than I published. But in my fanfic urge tends to come from wrapping up things or continuing things that I thought ended badly. Mm-hmm. I'm going to expose myself a little bit and say that I am plotting in a Google folder a how Glee should have ended.
I would like to read this.
It's a bunch of spreadsheets and like here are what these characters would be singing in these episodes. And that is, to me, is coming from a very specific impulse, which is, as a Glee fan, I am one of the people who thought 1 to 3 were good. 4 was eh. 5 was, we don't talk about 5. And then I am in the minority opinion of, I think 6 had incredible new characters, but at that point it was just basically over and I thought they were underserved. So my basic project for that whole fan, it's not even a fanfic, like fan outline, is, because it's really just like tables, which are like, this is what happens in this episode, here are the songs, but is, I would like a story where these characters who aren't like the main 12 get the closure and the narrative arc that I thought they should have gotten in the show. And that sort of, for me, it's very much a response to like how the text was originally, I don't want to say compromised, but I want to say like shaped in ways I did not necessarily like by the real world, i.e. ratings bad, show cancelled.
Yeah, and in addition to that, ratings bad, show canceled, but also just, I think the show changed with the, you know, they made music and they sold the music.
Yeah,
and when it became a music making thing, it was like, it was sort of like you watch the show and you're like, are you making the show because you want to put this popular song in here?
Right,
or like mix with the plot? Like, where is this going? So.
And then, like, so that happens, but then the waste of it is that they almost accidentally introduced these really interesting characters and then didn't do anything with them.
Yes.
I thought Puck's younger brother could have had an incredible arc. I thought the season 6 newbies were incredible, but like but by that point the show was like, let's be a vehicle to release covers of The Fox and Call Me Maybe.
Yes, and also we can't let go of these old characters because everybody loves them and we'll lose viewers, so we're just not going to pay attention to these new characters.
And like we're going to split the show into a school timeline and an alumni timeline and have them alternate, just, which was never what the show was built for. See, this is why you don't have to tell us to do unscripted small talk. We're just gonna do it.
Yeah. I wish we had more time to flesh this out. I am not familiar with Glee, but even I find myself fascinated by this. I think we can sort of end this note. You know, we began this discussion on fandom by looking at how we do fandom studies a little differently by focusing on the texts. But I think our participation is kind of like contributing to an archive, and to a certain extent, to participate in a fandom is almost like a participation into a kind of living text, you know, a living weave of meaning, so to speak, meanings and emotions and pleasures and whatnot. And I certainly had a pleasurable time talking to the two of you about this, and love to have this conversation again sometime. For now, though, thank you everyone for tuning in to our discussion. Hope you got something out of it, and hope it gets you thinking as well about your own particular investments and your own particular fandom relationships, which are ultimately about relationships with yourself. Thank you.
Yeah.